We will do our best. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming to TED. Thank you. Sam. Thank you.
Something unusual happens at the very end of this interview, and once you notice it, the entire conversation suddenly looks different. The conversation finishes. The audience applauds. Chris Anderson stands up to close the way TED hosts always do. And at that exact moment, Sam Altman turns and starts walking towards the exit before they even shake hands. Chris actually has to call him back. When I saw that the first time, I paused the video. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was rude. It was simply unusual enough that it made me curious. Why would someone do that in such a controlled environment? So I went back and watched the interview again, and then something interesting started to emerge. That small moment at the end actually reflects a much deeper pattern in the way Sam Altman operates. My name is Tatiana Teppoeva. I spent years building AI predictive systems at Microsoft. I know this world from the inside, and now I'm an nonverbal intelligence expert and a personality profiler. I decided to watch two interviews with Sam Altman very carefully, one at TED, another at Combinator. And once you place those two side by side, a very specific portrait begins to appear. But to understand it, we need to know what normal looks like for him. Because if we don't know someone's baseline, we cannot interpret any moment that follows. Before we look at the body language, there is one fact about Sam Altman that surprises many people. The company he runs has been valued at over $300 billion. His annual salary for many years was around $76,000. Zero equity. Now, before you think this is a story about sacrifice, it's not. By the time Sam Altman took the CEO role at OpenAI, he was already wealthy. His money came from years as one of Silicon Valley's most successful early-stage investors. Stripe, Airbnb, Reddit, Pinterest. He didn't need OpenAI equity to be financially secure. So the $76,000 salary was not a sacrifice, it was a signal. It said, I'm not here for personal gain. I'm not making decisions about the future of artificial intelligence because it will make me richer. The mission is clean. The incentives are transparent. Reports suggest that the company has been discussing granting him a significant equity stake as part of that restructuring. As of early 2026, nothing has been formally confirmed. The financial reward was not eliminated. It was deferred until the moment when aligning his interest with investors became strategically necessary. That is not altruism. That is long-term optimization. And once you start looking, you see that same logic operating in every part of his life. For years, he treated his own biology with the same logic he applies to machine learning systems. He lifted heavy weights 3 times a week. He fasted for 15 hours every day, had only espresso in the morning. He took metformin, originally a diabetes medication, as an anti-aging protocol. He did quarterly blood testing to track his numbers. He monitored his sleep. He once set himself a goal of cycling 100 miles in a single week. And then OpenAI entered its small critical phase. By late 2024, he was joking in interviews that he now does basically nothing. Occasionally eats junk food, doesn't exercise consistently anymore. The optimization system got suspended because the mission needed everything. That tells you something about his hierarchy of priorities. The body was always secondary. When the pressure became high enough, it showed. Notice this. Every single one of those behaviors follows exactly the same logic. Find the system, test the inputs, measure the outputs, and optimize. This doesn't look like someone who wakes up and simply decides how he feels that day. Instead, it looks more like someone who treats his own biology the way an engineer treats a system. You tune the inputs, you measure the outputs, and over time, you try to improve performance. And when someone lives this way long enough, it begins to shape not just how they think, but how they physically inhabit their body. And then he takes that exact same mindset and applies to building artificial general intelligence. I spent years working alongside people like this at Microsoft. I recognize the pattern. The body becomes almost secondary. It's the vehicle carrying the thinking process. And when you watch Sam Altman closely, you start to see exactly that in the way he sits, the way he listens, and the way he answers questions. When you watch Sam Altman speak, one thing becomes clear very quickly. His body is extremely contained. Shoulders slightly drawn inward, arms close to his torso, hands often resting together between his legs while he listens, head leaning forward and slightly downward as he thinks. You see this posture clearly at Combinator. Then you see almost exactly the same posture again on the TED stage. That is interesting because if this posture was coming from anxiety, it would change between the two settings. In a friendly room with fellow founders, you would expect him to open up, but he doesn't. This posture remains almost identical, which tells us something important. This is not stress behavior. This is structural behavior. This is simply how Sam Altman inhabits his body. Think about someone who spends years deeply immersed in technology and internal reasoning. Over time, the body adapts to cognitive pattern. The spine moves slightly forward, the shoulders come inward, the head drops as the brain processes information. People sometimes casually call this computer neck. Now compare that to a traditional corporate executive who spends most of their life managing rooms full of people. Straight spine, wide shoulders, still posture that communicates dominance. Sam Altman does none of that. He often looks like the least physically dominant person in the room. And that contrast is exactly what many viewers sensed. Hundreds of comments said, robotic, empty eyes, something is off, I don't trust him, but I can't explain why. Here is where I want to be careful, because this is a mistake I see many people, including body language analysts, make with someone like Sam Altman. They assume that low emotional display equals deception, or emotional emptiness, or something to be suspicious of. But there is another explanation, and I think it's more accurate. Sam Altman often looks down before answering a question. At first glance, it might look like hesitation or avoidance, but if you watch carefully, something specific is happening. He rarely begins speaking while he's still thinking. Instead, he appears to finish the entire thought internally first. Only then he looks up and delivers the answer. That means the audience is not watching him think on the fly. They are hearing the final version of the thought after the reasoning is already complete. Most speakers think out loud. You can hear the search for words, the self-correction, the improvisations. Sam does the opposite. The thinking happens privately, the answer appears afterward. And once we recognize that pattern, several moments in this interview start making much more sense. We are not looking at emotional distance. We are looking at someone whose attention lives almost entirely inside his own head. And once you see that, the interpretation changes completely. Sam built 300 billion in value, but he sits on a TED stage like someone who just survived an exam. Early in TED interview, Chris Anderson raises the difficult questions about intellectual property and AI training data. The audience applauds. And Sam responds with a line that quickly attracted attention. You can clap about that all you want. Enjoy.
At first glance, this looks like IP theft. Like, you guys don't have a deal with the Peanuts estate, or?
You can clap about that all you want. Enjoy.
Many viewers interpreted that as arrogance, almost as if he were dismissing the criticism entirely. But when I slowed down the video and watched his face right before he speaks, the emotion looked different. It doesn't look like superiority. It looks like irritation. But it was not irritation towards the question itself. It was irritation towards the applause. That distinction matters. Arrogance says, I'm above this discussion. Impatience says, this conversation just became less productive. If you imagine someone whose primary mode is internal reasoning, audience applause is not a meaningful signal. It doesn't move the argument forward. For someone whose attention is focused on the argument itself, applause can shift the conversation away from the reasoning and toward the crowd reaction. And that may be what we are seeing here. Remember what we established about how he processes? The thinking seems to happen internally first. So when the room reacts, the applause may not feel like part of the argument itself. You may agree or disagree with that mindset, but once you see it through that lens, the moment feels very different from arrogance. There is another moment later in the interview that very few viewers commented on, and to me it's one of the most revealing. Chris asks the big question, who gave you the moral authority to make decisions that may affect the future of all of humanity? Instead of answering directly, he tunes the question back toward Chris. He asks Chris what he thinks. Earlier in the same interview, Sam had already said, there are things I'm not going to say today. He had pre-mapped the territory.
You've been asking me versions of this for the last half hour. What do you think?
But what I would say is this. Here's my version of that question.
But no answer?
What was your question to me?
Yeah, how would you answer that one?
In your shoes?
Yeah. Or what do you, as an outsider?
I don't know. I am.
Maximum diplomacy on the surface, maximum persistence underneath. That combination is one of the most interesting things I observed in this entire interview. Now I want to show you two moments that reveal something deeper about who this person actually is. The first happens when Chris introduces a surprising element into the conversation. For a brief second, Sam's face shows genuine tension. His eyes widen slightly. His posture tightens. For just a moment it appears he didn't expect what was coming next. That reaction lasts maybe 2 seconds, then the composure returns. But those 2 seconds tells you something important. The control you see throughout the interview is real, it's maintained, and maintaining it takes effort. When it breaks, even briefly, you see the actual nervous system underneath. But then look at this. Chris shown Sam a photo of Sam's child. The strategist disappears. The controlled executive disappears. For a few seconds, you see a completely different expression. A young father looking at his child, open, unfiltered. That contrast tells you the full range. From one side, an intense analytical intelligence that doesn't perform outward. On another side, someone whose real self breaks through completely personal moment. He is not emotionally cold. He just lives almost entirely inside his own head. And when something real enters the conversation, you see the real person immediately. This becomes even clearer when you compare the two interviews directly, TED and Y Combinator. The physical setup is almost identical. 2 chairs, audience watching, similar casual clothes, jeans, sneakers, simple sweater, same style both times. But the person inside that posture is different. At TED, his voice cracks occasionally, his body is contained, held in, he answers carefully. There is something in the way he sits that looks to me like someone who is here because the interview is important and not because he wants to be here. At Y Combinator, the same person looks noticeably more relaxed. He smiles more freely. At one point, the interviewer says, "You are preaching to the converted." And Sam says, "This is awesome." The body is still held in that same structural way, but the face is completely open. He also talks about what he wishes someone had taught him earlier as a founder, about conviction, about resilience over a long period of time, about trusting that is eventually going to work out. And when he says this, his head goes down, he looks inward, and the body tightens slightly. He's genuinely accessing that memory. He compared being an entrepreneur to having a child. The good parts are better than you think, and the hard things are shockingly much harder than anyone can express to you. That's not rehearsed. That is someone who has actually been through that. So what is the difference between the two interviews? Not the person, but the context. At Y Combinator, he's authority. He's at home. He's sharing from a position of trust. At TED, he's being examined. And here is a diagnostic lesson for all of us. If you want to understand who someone really is, watch them in the room where they feel like the authority, not the room where they're being evaluated. The gap between those two versions tells you more than either version alone. So let me come back to where we started. Watch this carefully, because I think the whole portrait is contained in these 20 seconds.
We will do our best. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming to TED. Thank you. Sam.
Thank you.
Look at his body here. Chris is leaning forward, preparing for the closing ritual. Sam is already somewhere else. That small private expression on his face is not warmth toward Chris. To me, it's the face of someone whose performance has just ended, who wants to get out, and whose internal processing loop has already started running again. Chris uses the armrest, present, engaged. Sam rises with his head down, not looking at Chris or audience. Notice this. Sam's body has already turned towards the exit. He's not being rude. For someone whose primary processing happens internally rather than socially, closing rituals can lag behind the cognitive timeline. The thinking is done, he wants to get out, and his body wants to get back to work. Chris calls him back. Sam turns, and what you see on his face is not embarrassment. It appears to me like the slight recalibration of someone who had already left and has been asked to return. The man building our future walked off stage before anyone could shake his hand. Not because he's arrogant, not because he's cold, but because for him the performance was over. And when the performance is over, the mind wants to get back to work. The people building the next era of technology are not going to pause for the handshake. They are already thinking about the next problem. Whether that feels reassuring or unsettling to you probably says something about how you already think about what's coming.